I would like to now invite our next speaker, Mr. David S. Paul, who will be speaking on Rocketplane to Space Shuttle.
Thank you. Since I have a passion for astrophilately, I wanted to share with you the idea of moving from airplanes to spacecraft. So between 1947 and 1982, there was a transformation from airplanes to spacecraft. And I've been thinking about doing an exhibit, one that maybe had a purpose, talking about the evolution from experimental aircraft to the space transportation system, which was the space shuttle, taking rocket-powered aerospace vehicles from being supersonic to the test phases of vehicles that could travel around the world. And in the plan, I would talk about the first X-planes, the X-15, lifting bodies and component testing, and then finish up with the initial flights of the space shuttle. You know, in the United States, the space shuttle, which was kind of like a glorified space truck, had 135 missions. It went around the Earth and delivered satellites and did science and things like that. But the first four were experimental. They only had 2 pilots on board. They had ejection seats and parachutes and things like that. And it was just to test the vehicle. So at the end of World War II, or during World War II, there was an understanding that aircraft were changing. As fighter planes became faster and faster, the air that was in front of the aircraft as they flew faster would start to compress and make it difficult to fly. So when an airplane is flying 50 miles an hour, 100 or 200 or 300 miles an hour, the air is able to go past the propeller, go under and over the wing, and the aircraft is able to fly. But at some point, a plane is flying so fast that the air can't get out of the way. And they call that compressibility. The air actually gets compressed. And the thought was that from a theoretical perspective, it may be that there's a limit to how fast an airplane can fly. That at some point, a plane is flying so fast that it's essentially flying into a brick wall of air. That the air is so compressed that planes will just disintegrate. And what was happening in World War II, planes were flying into dives and going so fast that they were breaking up. And the thought was that maybe that was the limit of airplanes. Maybe they couldn't fly any faster. So an experimental aircraft was designed by the Bell Company in New York. And they were trying to decide what sort of aircraft might survive going faster than the speed of sound. And what they knew was that a 50 caliber bullet was stable in flight, and it flew supersonic. It flew faster than the speed of sound. So they designed an airplane that looked like a bullet, and they gave it very thin wings. And instead of having a reciprocating gas-powered engine, they gave it a rocket motor to make it go fast. And this became the Bell XS-1. It's experimental supersonic #1. And if any of you have seen, there was a movie called The Right Stuff. It talks about experimental aircraft and the start of the space program, the Mercury astronauts. In it, Chuck Yeager is featured as a test pilot who worked out at Muroc at Edwards Air Force Base. And he was the one who was piloting the Bell plane when it initially broke the sound barrier in 1947. So here's an envelope. There are no envelopes that were either carried on that flight or were postmarked on that day. So for people who are astrophilatelists, it's permissible to show an envelope that was an anniversary cover. You know, generally we don't like birthday covers and anniversary covers, but because we want to tell this story and because these envelopes don't exist, In this case, here's one with a stamp that was issued on the 50th anniversary of breaking the sound barrier, and this was flown by General Yeager faster than the speed of sound, and it's autographed by him. So that's kind of fun. There were other experimental aircraft made by Bell and by Douglas Aircraft and some others. Similar kinds of things. They had very thin wings. They were very streamlined. They had rocket engines, and they were all tested out in California because, first of all, it was dangerous. These things would break apart or go in funny directions. But they also had a lot of emergencies, and they needed long runways, so they would land out on the dry lake beds out in Southern California. So these are envelopes that were carried during those flights. In the Douglas 558-2, the Skyrocket, that was the first aircraft to fly twice the speed of sound, and that was done by Scott Crossfield, who was, I don't want to call him a nemesis. He was a competitor of Chuck Yeager. They would go back and forth trading records. The middle one there in the X2, that was carried by Frank Everest. He wrote a book called The Fastest Man Alive, and it was about his story as being a test pilot. And the reason that the book had that title is a previous pilot who'd flown the X2, Mel Apt, had flown 3 times the speed of sound, but as he was turning back towards the lake bed to land, the plane went out of control and crashed. So even though he was the fastest man, he was not the fastest man alive. And Frank Everest, who kind of picked up that work in one of the other X2s, wrote this book called The Fastest Man Alive. And with these envelopes, these were stamp collectors and said, hey, would you carry this for me? And generally, they didn't really have pockets in their suits, so they would just kind of, they would sit on them. They would sit on the envelopes. And so there might be a half a dozen or a dozen of each of these from these different flights. But the most famous, the most successful of the early experimental aircraft was the North American Model 240. The X-15. And this was originally mapped out in about 1954 and first flew in 1959. It had 199 powered flights, and there were a dozen pilots who flew it, starting with Scott Crossfield, who was a company pilot working for North American. Other people, Joe Walker, who was the head of NASA's test program out at Edwards, Neil Armstrong, who in 1962 would transfer over to be in the space program and became the first man to walk on the moon, and a number of others. There were 3 of these airplanes built, with the number 1, which is in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., was flown by all 12 pilots. And the other 2, the number 2 aircraft, was primarily done for speed runs, and the number 3 aircraft was done for altitude flights. And the first to fly the number 3 aircraft, the one that did the altitude flights, was Neil Armstrong. And that was the only aircraft that was lost during the test program. One of the pilots coming back essentially from outer space went into a hypersonic spin, meaning 5 times the speed of sound, and lost his life, and the airplane crashed. And in 1993, I led a group out in Southern California to go and see if we could find pieces of this plane, and we found probably about 20 pieces of the aircraft. And we did a lot of videotape of people from the program. I interviewed a couple of people who'd flown the aircraft, and it was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. So these were all people that flew this flight, these aircraft. Bob Rushworth, John McKay, Joe Engle. So Joe Engle was one of the later X-15 pilots, and he also transferred over to NASA to work as an astronaut. and he was scheduled to be on Apollo 17, the last mission to land on the moon, but he got bumped by a geologist to work on the lunar surface. And so Ingle got involved with the space shuttle program, and he was a pilot on the second flight of the space shuttle. And when he was being interviewed later, he said, you know, when I was coming in to land the space shuttle, I could have just closed my eyes, and there I was back in the X-15 coming in for a landing. Pete Knight, he flew the fastest the plane ever flew, which was nearly Mach 7. And they could have taken the plane even faster, but the friction from the air was so intense that it was burning holes. It was like a blowtorch, burning holes in the aircraft. And had he pushed it a little bit faster, he would have lost the aircraft. The only one to lose his life, Mike Adams, in November of 1967. Again, he was coming back from outer space, and they had some issues, and he lost his life. And Bill Dana, the last man to fly it, was the head of safety at NASA when we went out to go and visit, and he was in charge of the recovery efforts when the X-15 crashed. So I had an opportunity to talk with him and get some advice, and he showed me his old maps of where they were looking for the X-15, and that's where I went to go and look. And we found a number of pieces, because you can imagine when this broke up at 60,000 feet, pieces were strewn all over. And even though the major components from the aircraft were recovered, we found a lot. Now, if you wanted to fly, now you obviously with the X-15, you have a plane that can fly very fast, 7 times the speed of sound. But if you wanted to fly a plane into orbit and come back from orbit, you'd be flying significantly faster than that. You'd be flying 20, 25 times the speed of sound. And how could you possibly create an aircraft that could come back from outer space without burning up? I mean, imagine if you had a rock, okay, that was coming into the atmosphere, a meteor, okay, and a meteor, a rock that's coming into the atmosphere, actually burns up. That's why you can see it in the night sky, is because this rock is on fire. So if a piece of iron is melting and burning, you can imagine that something's just made out of aluminum cannot possibly survive coming back from orbit. So they were thinking, okay, so if we could get a plane to go fast enough and high enough that it could be in orbit, how could it possibly get back down if it needed to fly 25 times the speed of sound and be made out of something as soft as aluminum? So when they were thinking about it, they said, well, you know, the parts of the aircraft that would melt first, or the most vulnerable, would be the wings. So if you could create a plane that didn't have any wings, maybe you could create something to come back from outer space. So they looked at something called a lifting body. They said, well, you can get some aerodynamic lift that comes from the fuselage, where the pilot sits and where the majority of the airplane is, if you create it kind of like a bathtub. And so that's what they did. They did a series of experiments with aircraft that were kind of shaped like bathtubs to see whether or not that could absorb the heat and not have wings. So Bill Dana, in the upper left-hand corner, he flew the M2, and this was actually made out of plywood, and they towed it behind a souped-up muscle car, and this car dragged this airplane along until it got aloft, and it was kind of like a glider, and eventually they put rocket engines on it, and they beefed it up and created additional ones, the M2F3 and the HL10 and the X-24 and X-24B, and these are all precursors of what the space shuttle is going to end up being. At the same time, they were also looking at ballistic objects. So in the 1950s, when we had created nuclear weapons that were small enough and light enough to put on intercontinental ballistic missiles, one of the problems that we had was how to get the warhead to come back from outer space without burning up. So if a meteorite burns coming into the atmosphere, imagine if you have your warhead that has some very sensitive electronics in it is trying to come back at 25 times the speed of sound. How does that not malfunction and burn up? So they started with these lifting body concepts that they were blasting off on these boosters. So Project Asset and Prime were done to see whether or not ballistic objects could come back from space that would not only not burn up, but that you could guide them and steer them towards where you needed to be, either to a runway or to an enemy base or that sort of thing. So that's what the whole Asset and Prime projects were about. And that was mostly Air Force. And then once we decided that we were going to have this space shuttle that was going to have, we needed something that was going to come back from orbit. And not only was it going to come back once, because, when in the space program for Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, when we were coming back in the atmosphere, we had a heat shield on the bottom, and it had an ablative surface, which means that the bottom kind of chars off. It burns off, and as it burns, it takes most of the heat along with it. And those ablative surfaces were not meant to be reused. So when a capsule came back from outer space, you didn't have to worry about the bottom being charred because you were never going to use it again. But if you wanted a reusable orbital vehicle like the space shuttle, you needed different technology. And so that's when they came up with these idea of heat shield tiles. So the control center for the space shuttle goes all the way back to 1971. They set it up in Houston, and the shuttle wouldn't fly for another 10 years. But obviously, you need to get all that infrastructure together. And the documentation for the space shuttle program was astounding. For astrophilatelists, if you want to tell the most minute, detailed story of the space shuttle, you can, and you'll see a number of these covers, many too many covers to really tell an interesting story because it's just quite too detailed. This one here, a contractor cover, Grumman Aerospace, the people that made the lunar module and made all of the Navy fighters in World War II, they built the wing for the space shuttle. They were very proud of that. So the postmark there is from Long Island in Bethpage, where Grumman is based. Some of the component testing, the infrastructure, they needed to do model tests. Here's a 12-foot tall shuttle, and they're doing acoustic tests because you can imagine the vibration is enough that that these tiles, which are just glued on with felt, can easily fall off, or there can be cracks and things like that. So there are all different kinds of testing that need to be done. This cover here, in 1979, the Air Force created a shuttle facility so that they could launch the space shuttle from California. And the reason for this is the military is interested in polar orbits. If you do a polar orbit, you're able to create tracks that go over the Soviet Union and see what the enemy is doing. So in partnership with NASA, the Air Force had requirements that the space shuttle be able to change its orbit and be able to be launched from California. And so the Air Force was creating their own facility for launching the space shuttle. And because the space shuttle was lost in 1986, the Air Force decided they were not interested in launching. So that facility was never used. Some of the other things, here's a flight readiness firing. Here they're putting the external tank on the test stand. Different kinds of things. Here they're doing a simulated profile for an orbital flight, vibration testing. You can tell all kinds of stories with the detail of the envelopes that were created for this program. Shuttle tests for the tiles, wind tunnel testing. And then they had a space shuttle aircraft, a 747, where they would put the space shuttle on top of the 747, and that's how they transported it from the work that they did in California to Florida, where they were going to launch it. And then they had this whole mating structure where they would lift up the space shuttle and the 747 would drive underneath it, and they would latch it together. And so then they had to have a number of tests. So there was a carrier test where in these initial ones, they would just go taxiing on the runway and brake real hard and make sure that the shuttle didn't fall off. And then they had these unmanned captive tests where they'd fly around and just make sure that things were stable and it wouldn't rip the 747 apart. And then they did these approach and landing tests. And so it was quite the extensive testing. And then, so these were also captured out at Edwards for stamp collectors. And now you have to train the crews, because flying the space shuttle is a very different animal than flying an airplane. An airplane has and they call it an L over D. It's a lift versus drag ratio. So if the engine is off, if you're just gliding, you go a certain number of feet forward for the height that you lose. And it depends on what kind of plane you're in. So you have some kinds of planes, like you're in a glider that's very light and has very big, long wings, it can fly a very long distance without losing altitude. Then you have other things, like the space shuttle, which they describe as flying a brick. It just kind of falls out of the sky. Now, it has a little bit of lift because it has the wings, but very little. So they needed to create aircraft to simulate what was going on so that they could learn to land this aircraft. Because you only get one chance. Because when the space shuttle comes back from space, the engines are not running. And if you mess up your approach, if you're in the wrong place, you're out of luck. You're landing one way or the other. So they had this Gulfstream jet, and they said they dirtied it up. They put different kinds of flaps on it, and they ran the engines in reverse, and they made it very difficult to fly. And these guys would practice. Other kinds of things. So in addition to the orbiter, it had an external tank which would burn up that had the hydrogen, the fuel in it, but it also had solid rocket boosters on either side, and those boosters were reusable. So when they would separate, when the space shuttle is going into space, they would fall back into the ocean, and a ship would come by and drag them back to shore, and they'd be sent back to Utah, where they'd be clean and refurbished and used again. So that these solid rocket boosters would not be destroyed when they fell into the ocean, they were lowered by parachutes. So they needed to do this test to make sure that they could lower these big boosters into the water. And here you can see they'd land in the water, they'd pump air into them so that they wouldn't sink, and they'd put a tow line on them, and they would tow them back to shore. Then they were doing solid rocket motor tests. This is Morton Thiokol out in Utah. And here's a contractor cover where they're doing a static test on the solid rocket motor in Brigham City in Utah. And then they're doing main propulsion test firing, full duration tests. I thought this one was kind of fun. They put an explosive, TNT, inside the bell of the engine and detonated it. And they're looking to see whether or not these test explosions either change whether or not it destroys the vehicle, or in this case it says to define weather constraints which will be imposed on launch of the space shuttle. So they're doing all kinds of component and contingency testing of the propulsion systems. And then they had this series called ALT, Approach and Landing. So initially these were captive tests, then they were unpowered tests. Well, I guess they were always unpowered, but the crews would bring these in, and this was all about energy management. You would be released at 20,000 feet, and you'd have to circle around and make sure that your speed was at a certain number, and you wanted to be lined up with the runway, and you only had one land. And so that's what these guys were practicing. And where they learned energy management, where they learned to do powered off landings, was in the X-15. The X-15 taught them everything that they needed to know, except, of course, this is a much bigger, heavier test vehicle. So here they are doing a bunch of different kinds of things, solid rocket booster tests and different kinds of parachute drops. And then we finally get to STS-1. And here's an example of where we've sent, for the first time, we've sent a space vehicle into space with men on it without testing it unmanned first. I mean, before Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, those were all sent unmanned to make sure that they weren't going to blow up, that they were going to work correctly. We used robots or monkeys or, but we didn't put people in it. We made sure that it was man-rated before we did anything with it. But the space shuttle was different. We had two pilots, John Young, who ended up being on 6 missions for NASA, was in charge, and his co-pilot, Bob Crippen. And they took the shuttle up on April 12th, 1981. And April 12th is kind of a neat date, because on April 12th in 1944, that was the day that the first V2 escaped Earth's velocity. It was kind of the dawn of the space age with the V2, and it was also April 12th that Yuri Gagarin was the first man to fly in space. So here they are on April 12th, 1981, and a couple of different kinds of covers. Here's a contractor cover from Thiokol, which are the people that make the solid rocket booster. This was flown on a helicopter out of Patrick Air Force Base. So these are pararescue men that are at the launch facility in case they launch and they have to do an abort near Florida. This is an alternate emergency landing site at White Sands in New Mexico. And it turns out that they actually used this facility on STS-3 because of weather. They actually landed in New Mexico once. Here's an abort facility in Rota, Spain, and then a ship that's monitoring at sea. Here's Liberty is one of the ships that tows in the solid rocket booster. So all different kinds of things that you can use to document. Here's the first time we reused a space shuttle. This is STS-2 with Joe Engle, who flew the X-15. And this is called a NASA exchange cover. It's got the emblem of the mission on it, and it's postmarked at the Kennedy Space Center on November the 12th, 1981, the day that they took off. Here's a European contractor cover that has a roller cancel from KSC. And the Canadians were very proud of their participation, and they've been tremendous in the space program. And one of the contributions that they made in this case to the space shuttle is the remote manipulating arm that is used to deliver satellites to space and to pluck them out of space. And that technology came out of Canada. Some more different kinds of things, different kinds of testing and rescue flights. And, you know, part of the story is also once they get back and they land out at the dry lake bed in Edwards, they need to do that ferry flight again, right? They need to put it on the back of the 747 and take it back. So there's a ferry flight date. And STS-3, and by now they're pretty much aware of what the capabilities of it are, and they're kind of working out the bugs. And this is the one that because of weather ended up landing in New Mexico, which was quite the surprise. And then the STS-4, which was greeted by the president. President Reagan came by to greet the pilots when they got back. Hartsfield and Mattingly were the last to fly it as an experimental vehicle. And with STS-5, they started taking scientists on board, and eventually they'd have a crew of 6 or 7 people on the shuttle. But for now, these were the last where they were experimental test pilots with ejector seats and parachutes. And here you can see these are contractor covers from United Technologies, and these are the ships that are dragging the solid rocket boosters back. Okay, and that's it.
Thank you, Mr. David S. Ball.